Good evening and welcome to Gaming Ballistic's Firing Squad. I am joined today by David Kenzer of Kenzer and Company. We may have some other people join a little later. This is a special event for me because David has agreed to join after we already recorded this yesterday. And we got 90 minutes of great video and 0 minutes of audio. So there's a whole lot of animated conversation, but it is literally animated with no voices. So Kenzer and Company was gracious enough to do this a second time. So thanks for joining me again.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me a second time. I know for sure Jolly's not coming. Steve's probably not going to be able to make it either. Doesn't look like today. So maybe I'm the only forgiving one of the group.
Which is entirely fair. You know, batting .333 is pretty good in the major leagues, so I'll take it where I can get it. So what I wanted to do is, for people who aren't as familiar with the history of Kenzer and Company, maybe you could briefly lay out some of the highlights, when the company started, first product, the breadth of your portfolio, because I knew of Kenzer from Hackmaster and Night to the Dinner Table, and not much necessarily more than that. But as I dug in, I found we conversed yesterday. You have a very broad, dynamic, interesting product portfolio. So why don't you walk through a little bit of the history of the company so people know where you're coming from as we talk about the Kickstarter that you're currently running and some of the other games that you've done.
Sure, I'll be as brief as you can, covering essentially 25 years of game industry history. So formed the company originally in '93. It was myself and 5 of my buddies. The only one really still with us is Brian Jelke, who's one of the development team members and of the original ones. But you could count Steve Johansson there because I think he joined us. I don't know. I want to say we started like in May of '93, and Steve joined us in June. So, you know, he was probably number 7 through the door. It's interesting. I don't know that everyone has the same experience in forming a game company, but, you know, we did it just, you know, whoever happened to be sitting around the game table with us, which is actually not the way you want to do it. If you're going to form a company with other people, what you really want to do is make sure that your interests, not just your interests are aligned, but your work ethics are aligned, and the way you want to run a company is all aligned. And we didn't necessarily have that alignment. What we had was a group of guys that liked to run through 1E dungeons together. So we thought the same sort of stuff was cool, but that was kind of where the syncing sort of ended. SYNC syncing. So you know, most of the guys we started the company with are still around in some capacity. They're shareholders, or they hang out with us or whatever. But, you know, 95% of the people that have come and gone have just gone. And so anyway, that's how we started the company. Lots of people think that I started the company because of the name, and that's, you know, pretty interesting. But, you know, I've told this story before, but maybe it's new to your viewership. The way the name of the company was formed was I filled out the paperwork to incorporate the company, and I put in Kenzer and Company as a placeholder, and there were probably 5 or 6 other people involved besides me at the time. And Brian Jelke in particular, I remember very well, he looked at it and said, "Who picked the name?" And I said, "I put that in. If you guys don't like it, you can pick another one." So we debated other names, you know, Thunderbolt Games, whatever, for like probably an hour, and there was no consensus. And I said, "You guys got a week to come up with another name or this paperwork goes in." And that's what happened. So I'm not even a majority shareholder. I think I probably have the most stock in the company, but, you know, we probably have 20 shareholders, and, you know, I could easily be voted out as president at any given time with, you know, just a handful of them getting together. So it's not like it's my company, and that's what most people think, which, you know, is fine by me. So I'm proud to have my name on it. Anyway, so that's how the name started. But quickly, our first product was Kingdoms of Calamar. It was a generic fantasy setting. We made it for Dungeons and Dragons. We put it right there on the label for use with Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And we made kind of a splash in the industry there because people were like, "Wow, why are they doing that?" At the time, TSR was sending out letters to people and crushing people's hopes. I was studying IP law at the time, and I kind of knew we were well within our rights, and so I was not super concerned about that. I was in law school when we started the company, and we never heard from them. Maybe we just weren't successful enough. I don't know. And we sold on the order of thousands. We went through a couple of print runs, and we did a couple of modules. But where we really took off was in '96 when we made our collectible card game, Monty Python: The Holy Grail. We got a license from Python Paren Monty Pictures, which is the name of their corporation, and it was very fun doing that. We've talked about this already. Michael Palin signed the contract, so that was super cool. Although his signature was pretty hard to read, I actually had to ask their agent who signed it, and then after he told me, I kind of looked at it, I was like, yeah, I can see that. All right. So I have a fax copy of Michael Palin's autograph somewhere in a box somewhere with our, legal stuff from the '90s. So that was great fun, and we sold a lot of that product. I'm not sure how many people played it. I wouldn't say it was our crowning achievement in game design, although it was a fun game to play, and we had some really great ideas. And the graphics on there, we were capturing things from a laser disc. Yeah, that's where we're capturing the images from. And then they sent us actual film copies of the movie, and then we were scanning. We were actually cutting the movie, the film, and we were scanning the film to make the pictures, make the images for the cards. And it wasn't. I'm sure every one of your viewers has seen the movie, but you might not have thought about it. It wasn't actually filmed with the highest quality. I don't know how much you know about the background of Monty Python: The Holy Grail, but I think their budget was like on the order of $10,000, and they had like 2 or 3 investors, one of which was Led Zeppelin, and they filmed it mostly in the backyard of, I think it was also Michael Palin's backyard, but I could be wrong on which Python guy it was. It wasn't Cleese or Idol, but anyway, they filmed it mostly in a guy's backyard and then on free location. So the footage itself was terrible. So if I look at the cards now, I'm like, wow, it's pretty grainy. They're not like, it's not like Magic the Gathering or Pokemon or anything like that.
Right. No, and I know that the movie ends the way it does because they ran out of funds. I mean, the movie ended because that was it, right? I mean, they didn't end it on a cliffhanger, so to speak, by choice. They sort of said, "Oh, and we're done." Because I remember after all the jokes and all the at the table references, I finally sat down and watched it front to back. And at the end, I'm like, "But where's the ending?" And they're like, "Nope, that's one of the bizarre things about the movie is that it just ends."
Well, you got all keyed up because they were going to have this giant fight, and you were actually kind of into it.
Right. Okay, so that brings you through the collectible card game, and I guess it makes sense that a lot of people would buy it, and no one would play it. It's not a play card game; it's a collectible card game. They collected it.
Yeah. Well, there were people playing it. We had a pretty good Gen Con in Gen Con '96. I remember I basically for 3 days straight served as a maitre d'. All I did was people came to the booth. We had spots for 36 people or something like that to demo, and they were filled beginning from 10 a.m. till 6 p.m. every day, and it was just guys were waiting in line. I was just, there's an open spot, and putting people in spots to play demos. But and that was kind of the height of the card craze. I'd say was probably 94 to 98, somewhere in there. So in any case, Jolly joined the company at the end of '96, I want to say. And the beginning of '97, we released our first Knights at the Dinner Table magazine. He had done 3 comic books, 32-page comic books. Might have only been 24-page, but 3 comic books, first 3 issues, with under his old company, Alderac Entertainment Group, a company that he founded. A lot of people don't know that. And then when he left his other partners, he walked away from that company. He brought Knights at the Dinner Table with him to join us. And I got a certain reputation in the industry of being a lawyer in a fairly tough one. It's interesting that Jolly joined the company because I was the most honest person he could find. So, make what you will of that.
Well, I mean, honesty and being a tough lawyer don't necessarily go in opposition to each other, right?
Yeah. it's a quirk I have. My sister-in-law once bought me a giant plaque that said "Honest Lawyer" that I had up in my garage for a while. So in any case, Jolly joined up forces with us, and we shared very common interests. He started writing for Calamar right away. We put out an adventure together very quickly. You know, that kind of takes you through 97. And we got into Nights at Dinner Table took off like a rocket once we started going monthly. We sold like 3,000, then 5,000, then 5,000, then 7,000. Next thing you knew, we were doing 20,000 a month, and literally everybody in the industry was reading this thing.
Wow.
And we did 20,000 a month for a long time, actually. And that was super popular at the time. And we ended up branching off. We ended up doing a couple other comic books. We did Hackmasters of Evernight, which was a spin-off of that. We did a comic called Avalon for a while. We did a comic called Nights at Dinner Table Illustrated, which kind of like was from the point of view of the characters. Although it's amazing now, I feel like there's a lot of people that don't know what Nights at Dinner Table is, younger people that are joining the industry. I think we're on track maybe by next year to pass Cerberus as the longest running comic in the history of mankind, from a single creative group. I'm sure we'll pass that. A lot of people don't know that either. And for a gamer comic to do that, we're already way past guys like Superman and Spider-Man and guys like that, because they've had multiple groups.
Because the creative team turns over. Right. Yeah.
And we've been consistent for, whatever, over 20 years. So
can I break in for a sec? Because so 10,000 a month.
20.
Right? I mean, I know in some of the, it was 10 or 20,000 a month. I mean, that's phenomenal. Year after year, it sounds like.
Month after month, yeah.
Yeah. But the in the OSR, if you have an independent publication that sells 500 to 1,000 copies, people talk about it as a success, and that's ever. Is that basically saying, yeah, role-playing games are hard, and collectible card games and comics are, I'm not discounting the quality of it. I've read Nights at the Dinner Table, not all of it, but it's hysterical, and it's well made, and it's on point, especially if you're a gamer. But is it an entirely different level of sales for a comic book or a collectible card game than it is a typical role-playing game, or did you see that level of buy-in for many of your products?
We definitely did that level of buy-in for some of our products, but I wouldn't say many. I think it's pretty well publicized, or at least if you look around on the web or read some wiki pages, you can learn some of the detail of what happened with Wizards of the Coast and Kenzer and Company. But the end result was that the route we decided to go was to sign 3 licenses with them. One was to do an official D&D comic, which we did, and that was successful, nowhere near as successful as Nights at Dinner Table. And we got a license for all the everything prior to third edition Dungeons & Dragons, which we used to make Hackmaster, the role-playing game, which was, I would describe it as 25% first edition, 25% second edition D&D, 25% new material, and 25% just kick-ass attitude. So that was in that one game of the year 2001. That game definitely sold that level, Nights at Dinner Table level. We did a lot of products for that game as well. And there was just a huge pent-up demand. I know that now there's a big trend everyone knows about, retro clones. Like, that term didn't exist. There wasn't even such a thing until Hackmaster. There was no market for that. There was nothing like that.
Right.
Hackmaster was the retro clone, and everything else past that was like, wow, look how successful those guys are. Maybe we should try this.
Did you guys basically pave the way for the OGL, or was that concurrent?
It was concurrent. They did the OGL at the same time. We didn't know they were doing that. In fact, we felt a little like they pulled the rug out from under us, because at the same time, our third license was to make Kingdoms of Calamar an official Dungeons & Dragons product. And in fact, that was our third edition of Calamar, and that also sold on the order of Nights at Dinner Table. That came out, actually, it was the first campaign setting for 3rd edition. It was before Forgotten Realms. It actually beat them to market by a couple months. And I actually think it's a far superior product. It's just that we just don't have the marketing behind it. In any case, and the old Forgotten Realms creator himself wrote for us, and in Kalmar wrote a city supplement for us called Gianaview Stones of Peace at Greenwood, concurrently at that time. So maybe 6 months or 9 months after Kalmar had come out. So at the time when we had that license, they didn't tell us anything about the OGL. They announced the OGL like literally a month or so before we released Kalmar. You know, our stuff was at the printer in China or something like that, and we're like, wait, what? Other people are gonna make Dungeons & Dragons. They say, oh, but they're not gonna have the Dungeons & Dragons brand. You guys are gonna have the brand. So what we learned through that process was Dungeons & Dragons brand wasn't worth that much. In fact, the Kalmar brand ended up being worth as much as the Dungeons & Dragons brand. When you took it off, the sales were about the same. Mostly because after the OGL came out, all consumers were educated enough to realize it was all for 3rd edition. It didn't matter. And I think that wasn't true. If you go 10, 15 years earlier, you go to like the early 80s, Dungeons & Dragons brand was massive. And while you had like things like Rolaids and other products that were available from Mayfair Games or Judges Guild, everyone knew it wasn't Dungeons & Dragons. And the Dungeons & Dragons brand just carried a lot more with it. So in any case, that was our experience. So that takes us to kind of 2005 to 2007. We still had the license through 2007. And we made, I guess maybe the year before that, we made our first miniatures game. We made Fairy Meat, which also sold a ton. We sold a lot. It didn't sell 20,000 copies, but it sold a lot. And that was a very popular game. It had about, I don't know, 8 or 10 supplements with it as well. I don't know if you've ever heard of Fairy Meat, but so it's the only 1-to-1 scale miniature game ever made.
Oh, interesting.
The fairies are 25 millimeters tall, and that's actually,
And that's how big the fairies are. That's funny.
And you don't need green because fairies exist in real life. So you would just set up your table with a Coke can and some dice or whatever, and your fairies just flew around. But the idea was the fairies, they're super cute little guys, but they're all cannibals. And so when you defeat another fairy, there's life points on the table there, and you eat the fairy. And as you eat it, you become more powerful. And of course, there's gnomes and other things. Gnomes are much bigger. They're like,
well, they're about this big with the red hats, and they sit outside mostly. Yeah,
they are about that big. They did have funny hats. They're about 8 inches tall, 6 inches tall. Anyway, we made our own miniatures too. We had our own miniatures line, Hackmaster miniatures, and we had Fairy Meat miniatures. We made another miniatures game called Final Days, which used a lot of the mechanics from Fairy Meat. And it always was a head scratcher to me that game didn't do better. It had zombies, and it took place after the apocalypse, and everyone that's ever played it was just like, wow, this game is so awesome. And I don't know what happened. We never really sold very well in that game. We didn't lose money on it. We haven't lost money on products in general, pretty much ever, but it didn't sell as well as I expected. So that one's kind of a head scratcher. We may come back with that someday in Kickstarter or something.
I almost wonder if instead of fairy, which most people, this is the 90s and the early aughts, so you say fairy, I think people think Disney. Or if you say fae or something, maybe they think more evil cannibal stuff. I don't know. Maybe it's the power of the word fairy in people's minds as being light and fluffy and cute, because people have forgotten the original lore where, if you don't cut your hand and blood the well and leave out a treat for the fairies, they kill a cow and dump it in there and poison your land. Right? I mean, the fae were mysterious and cruel and capricious, and and we right now, you think fairies, you think Tinkerbell, and the coolness of it has been, and the mystery and the nastiness of it that I think would attract different people has been somewhat lost.
Yeah.
I'm going out of my way in Dragon Heresy to make really nasty fae. So,
The cover of our product was a mushroom with a cute fairy sitting on it. eating the leg of another fairy very clearly with blood all over him. So it was it was fairly graphic. We made our first. We made a couple of board games. One won Elemental, I think, won an Origins Award also, and then we made The Great Space Race, which probably should have won an award. That was an amazing game. Craig Zipsey designed that. It's a great game. That was our first sort of premium big box, like $60 board game. That one did very well for us also, and has a pretty good following. We may kickstart that again. It's been out of print for at least 10 years. And then we made Aces and Eights 2007, which was our second role-playing game. And that also won Best Game along with Hackmaster. So the first two role-playing games we wrote both won Best Game. And we sold a lot of that game too. We went through 2 printings. So I just didn't print a third time because I kind of felt, I wasn't sure. I knew that there was still demand, but I wasn't sure there was enough to eat the whole printing.
Sure.
And so you don't want to print 5,000 more books and sell 500. And so we just didn't pull the trigger. We waited. And we watched all the original books go up on eBay for $200, which is, I think, until we launched this new Kickstarter, a week or two ago, books were still going for $200.
Right, and that's a strange thing. I know GURPS Martial Arts will occasionally sell for a couple $100 because it's out of print and it's hard to get. And it's, as soon as it comes back in print, of course it'll drop off. But and were those the size of your print runs? About a couple thousand, 5,000? Is that a typical print run for what you guys like to do?
Yeah. It varies by game, and it also varies by product. Like if you're making a 3-book system, you want to print less probably your Game Master's Guide than you do, but the monster books and players handbooks, you can put out those sorts of numbers. And the problem is always when you're going to reprint, when you sell a product and you go to reprint, that's always like the real gut check. And you want to make sure you have built into your profit margin for your first print run enough to do a second print run. But then once that money's in your pocket and you're trying to figure out, like, do I invest this in another print run, or do I invest this in the next game that we're making? So that's always a difficult choice, or 3 more modules, or whatever it is you're going to do. So
right. It's a good point to reiterate for people getting used to the business, though. Make sure that when you sell your last book of whatever print run you're doing, that you have paid for your next one. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself as if you'd never written the game at all. And finding new investment and finding new money, especially, God forbid, if it's your only product, you'll be like, wow, I've done so well, and now I have to scrape up money to hopefully recover it rather than having planned for it. It was one of those things that I remember reading a year or so ago before I incorporated, that really struck me as true, is make sure that you are pre-funding continuing business, which is like one of these little truisms where after you hear it, you're like, well, of course. But there are lots of those, and there are lots of people who are bankrupt because they didn't do it.
Yeah, I would say the number of companies that are left since we started are probably, you can count on one hand. There's nobody. I mean, everyone eventually goes bankrupt in this industry, or very few retire out on top. And on those that I'm counting, that includes like distributors.
Oh, sure, right.
I mean, there's probably a bunch of retailers that are still around, that have been around for 30, 40 years. But when we started, I think there were 7,000 retail stores, and I'd be surprised if there were 700 now. So.
Yeah, no, I believe it. And the joke that I always make, which was really I stole from aviation, which is the best way to make a small fortune in the games industry is to start with a large one.
Yeah.
So that brings us up to Aces and Eights. And so before we get into the mechanics, I want to talk about Westerns briefly, because I think that sets the stage for how you guys approach the game development, based on our conversation yesterday. So it's like I'm like all educated about this because we've already had this conversation. But still, let's talk about the important tropes and what makes Westerns endearing and deep and compelling to people. Because Star Wars is a space western. Firefly is a space western. Seven Samurai, I think, was a remake of Magnificent Seven, although it could have been the other way. But right, so but the tropes of the western are come again.
It's the other way. Magnificent Seven was
a remake of Seven Samurai.
Off of Seven Samurai, which is
okay.
Was fine, and they're both great movies. So, but Seven Samurai was clearly first.
Okay. So the tropes of the western are still with us, and what is it about westerns as opposed to fantasy, as opposed to, Star Trek-ish stuff, which was of course around since '65, and great sci-fi fantasy from the pulp era. What is it about the western that you said, you know what, we're going to do a game, and we're going to do a western game, and it's going to be awesome, and this is why?
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, my first love will always be fantasy, and I think that's true for all of us. And as an industry as a whole, I mean, fantasy dominates. But I like to look at it. There's maybe 10% of the people in our industry that they have another genre outside of fantasy that's their favorite, and the rest are fantasy. But even the 90% that are full fantasy, they all got a second and maybe a third genre that they really think is cool that they'd be willing to do, whether that's Star Wars, space opera kind of thing, or straight up like Gamma World kind of sci-fi, or a Western, or a gangbusters kind of 1920s rum runner sort of game, or I think a genre that no one's really ever done is pirates. There's 7th, but it's actually not a pirate game. It's actually like a Renaissance Three Musketeers kind of game. It's really not pirates. Did an excellent job marketing to make it look like pirates, but it isn't. There was a pirate game I once played called I can't remember what it's called, but I've only seen like one or two true pirate games. So I'm going to try to make a pirate game at some point because I think it needs to be done. Westerns were kind of, for me, were this, I played Top Secret. I played all the TSR ones, Gamma World, everything. But Boot Hill was always the one that actually everyone got into the most outside of Dungeons and Dragons. So when it was time for us to pick another genre, for me, Boot Hill was my experience of the best. We did that a lot more. Jolly had a different experience. He played the shit out of Gangbusters. And so he was, mobster guy. But he also really liked Westerns. And, we're a little older than most of the gamers are now. I mean, it wasn't that way when we started. We were 25-year-old punks. Now we're all, pushing 50 or in our 50s. And so we're kind of the old guard. But when we were kids, you couldn't turn on the TV without Western. Sci-fi was just in its nascency. I was watching reruns of Star Trek, but like there was, and there was a bunch of, sci-fi Martians invading kind of stuff, but that was sort of it. But Westerns were completely dominant. I mean, they were dominating they had just finished dominating the box office. Probably, I don't know what their demise was, the musical in the 60s, but from the start of motion pictures to like the end of the 50s and into the 60s, like Westerns were it. So, I kind of grew up with it. So that's why we picked that. And we dabbled in a bunch of genres with Knights of the Dinner Table, and probably our most popular strips were the Cattle Punk strips outside of the straight up Knights. So it seemed like a natural for us. So we went Western.
What were the tropes that you found most compelling? So we're going to say, okay, we're going to bring the Western feel to a role-playing game. What part of that did you want to make sure that people were able to experience? And then we'll segue from, and then how do we turn that into mechanics?
Well, we had a very simple, we all kind of had the same experience with Boot Hill and other Westerns that we had played, which all kind of went like this. Everyone makes characters. You try to play the game the way you think it might have been written, and then you all go rob the bank and become outlaws. And it always degraded into that. And part of it was gamers didn't really know what else to do. And you have these guys that are characters that are set for shooting, and so you want to shoot things. and you want to shoot other people. And so that drove a lot of our game design decisions from a world building standpoint, and which I can get to in a minute. We didn't cover that yesterday. And kind of our design decisions. We wanted to make a Western that people would role play and you could keep your character for longer than 2 sessions. Because eventually, if you just keep doing bank robberies, you're going to get shot and you're going to die because there's no magical healing, right? And there were, you know, like Deadlands was a pretty successful game, and that was Wicked West, so it was a little different. If you're going to go with kind of a historical or, you know, pseudo historical, like you get shot, you're shot, and like the best case scenario, you're out for a couple of months, and your worst case scenario, you know,
you're done.
Sawbones hacks off your limb, or you bleed out on the table, right? Or you die of lead poisoning or whatever, right? So we kind of like verisimilitude. We like realism. We like games that are believable, where you can get lost in the game. And I think that's super critical to role playing. So we set out for a game that was like that. So we needed to simulate gunfights to make them real. And our logic was that if the gunfights were as deadly as they were in real life, meaning you could, by luck, survive several, but eventually your number comes up, people will wise up and they'll do other parts of the game. And so we introduced an entire mechanic around profession paths. And they reward players with building points to grow their character by progressing along various progression paths. And it could be anything. It could be, heck, we had one that was prostitute. You know, you could, and when you get to the end, you know, there's different levels of it. And the highest you could be as a prostitute is, you know, you own a cat house or maybe multiple cat houses, like, I don't know, the franchise. So, you know, or a saloon owner. But there's also, you know, outlaw, there's lawman, there's rancher, I think we have like 60 professions. And the game's designed where it gets harder and harder to progress. It takes months and months of game time. So if you're impatient, you want to grow your character, you just quit and you do something different. And that's how the game is designed.
And you made the point yesterday that that's exactly what some of these famous people in the Old West actually did. They had a great number. You know, you talked about how Wyatt Earp, everyone knows him as a lawman, but he was several things.
Yeah, pretty much everybody that you've heard of in the West did a bunch of different things, whether they were, you know, started out as, you know, a mountain man or something, and then 15 years later found themselves as a prospector or whatever. You know, almost everybody you read about in the West had multiple professions. And I was, to a ludicrous degree, I was kind of influenced by the movie Little Big Man. I don't know, you know, if you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's famous because it was the first movie that actually showed Indians as human beings and not marauding orcs. And it was all from the point of view of the Indians to a great extent. But the guy in the movie that it was about, Dustin Hoffman, he was like, I don't know, supposed to be 120 years old, and he was telling about his life, but that was the first 30 or 40 years of his life, and he did like a dozen different things, right? And so that's kind of what the game plays like. You do a bunch of different professions. But on top of that, because the gunplay is so dangerous, you're not really meant to use your character as the gunfighter. You might start that way. You might get kind of good at it, but eventually you figure out, now I've got more to lose than I want to lose. So I'm going to do something else. Like I want to own the saloon, and then I'm going to have a couple of hired thugs, and they're going to be so then the session that you have the gunfight, your hired thugs are doing the shooting, not your main character. So you start to get like henchmen and hirelings, if you will, around you that they're now enforcing things for you. And if those guys die, then you know, it's a loss to your character, but you go find another guy, right?
Right.
And that's how it continues. So it plays out a lot more like the the HBO series Deadwood. You're really town building at some point. We have maps of these cool towns. You have plat surveys and all this stuff, and you're like, hey, I want to get, you know, lot B17 because it's kind of central. I'm going to put a saloon in there.
Right.
And eventually there's a guy across the street who's pissing you off, so you're going to send one of your thugs over there. That's how you end up playing the game, a lot more than fantasy-esque thing where it's your character and he's going to go kick down doors and kill the orc. It doesn't work as well in a Western.
It sounds a little bit like, it's a little more abstract, but it sounds like domain level play, right? Instead of you've got the castle and you send out your armies and you lead the armies personally, in a way it's a small scale, more personal domain level play where you're the boss of a bunch of people and you're going to go intimidate the ranchers on the north side of town, and so you'll play one of the thugs today instead of your main character, or maybe you bring your main character but you also have your thugs.
Yeah, I mean, and that's kind of the way things played out often in the West, right? I mean, if you were a rancher, you had a ranch, you had a bunch of hands, and those you generally yourself didn't go and fight over water rights with the guy next to you. You sent 3 of your guys over to kick down the fence or whatever, and if they got in a scrape because of that, then they got in a scrape. If it's a really big important thing, maybe you show up and you've got 4 or 5 of your dudes, and he's got 4 or 5 of his dudes, and if it turns out to a gunfight, you know, and you're the Clantons and you're not the Earps, and you got a problem. But that's kind of how things really were. So we try to design our games to be like things could be, and I said the world building kind of supported that. So let me just get to that.
Sure.
If you do want to become basically a bank robber or a criminal, the reason it fails when you're playing a historical Western is because eventually the U.S. Marshals will catch you, or the Pinkertons or somebody. You've got no chance to survive long term. You know, maybe you escape to South America, but you're off the map. You're done with the game. We kind of created an alternate history, and we took a very contentious election, and we switched it kind of the other way, starting in the 1840s, and we just ticked a few boxes a different way, but kept basically everything else as the way it was in Planet Earth, and we ended up with the North and South fighting to a draw, and that created a whole different situation in the West. So instead of one nation controlling the entire West where the cavalry could show up, now you've got, because of the way we've done the past history, we have the following countries there. You have the United States of America, but you also have the Confederate States of America, and you have Texas was his own nation still. Then you have we have the country of Deseret, which is that's the Mormon country. You have Mexico is still there. If you go far northwest enough, you still have England, but that they're usually not so much involved in the game. But you do definitely have Mexico, and you have an Indian nation called Sequoia. So you have all these different countries, and where our game takes place in this an area called the Cauldron, and greater than that, what we call the Shattered Frontier. It's a frontier, but it's not. It's claimed by everyone, but it's owned by no one. So you could be in a Texican town, and then 6 miles down the road could be a Confederate town. Well, it's technically not against the law to go down to the Confederate town and shoot a few people and take their stuff. They may come after you,
right?
But it's certainly not against the law, because there's still technically a civil war going on, even though it's in a state of draw, and where there's like an armed Mason-Dixon line is armed, but there isn't confrontation going on.
It's more like the demilitarized zone, where things are just simmering and could blow up in any minute. But
out west, you could be vigilantes. You and 6 guys could take your horses and ride into the Confederate town and shoot up some of those slave owners and free their slaves. And then, by the way, while you're there, rob the bank. And now you're not an outlaw, because when you come back to the U.S. town that you left, maybe you're a hero.
Right.
Maybe you get deputized before you even do it. So we solved that problem with that. So if you do want to have that sort of game, you can. And so I think Aces and Eights allows a lot of different types of Western play, and I don't think that had been done before.
Yeah, no, and it's important to set the stage like that. Like, I'm working on a game with David Pulver, and we've had long conversations about how are we going to drive the setting. It's a science fiction game. How are we going to drive the setting to allow people to play the games that they want to play? Space piracy. You get these, right? It's actually very much the same thing you just said. It's hard to have space piracy in certain genres because the entirety of the U.S. Navy is one squadron, and they can just show up and kick your ass.
Right.
And so how are we going to stage it so that you can have the kind of games that you want to play. And it sounds like that's exactly what you did, except, you know, in 2007, 10 years ago.
You tried calling anyone in Somalia to find out how they did it? Because they were
Right.
Somali pirates were kind of successful.
Right. To a limited extent, except, you know, whenever you go up against the U.S. Navy, it doesn't work out so well.
No.
But that's the key, right? Is it's a broken power structure, so that individually you can be a fairly big fish in a relatively small pond. And if you don't become the nail that sticks up and draw, actually, you know, you see a lot of that in supernatural games. Like in like a lot of the premise of what Monster Hunters International from the Larry Correa books and stuff like that is, you know, or the Dresden Files, right? Where you don't want to bring too much attention to the supernatural stuff, because if everybody knows about it, then 7 billion swarming humans come after you.
Right.
Right. And that kind of thing. So, you know, make sure that distributed power structure, that fractured frontier, seems to be a key element in telling the kind of stories that gamers want to play.
Yeah, and it, you know, we kind of, you know, it was a long evolution to get there, and I won't go into all of it, but, you know, another show that greatly influenced me, and I know Jolly, was Lonesome Dove. And the way, if you have never seen that Western, it's got to be one of the best Westerns ever. And I shied away from it because of the name, and, you know, had that guy Dan Tana in there and stuff. But when I finally saw it, it's great. And that movie starts, I mean, these guys are Texas Rangers, they're lawmen. They go across the border in Mexico and steal a bunch of cattle and horses. Like, that's how they get their herd. And so in their minds, it's like not, you know, it may have not have been the right thing to do morally, but it certainly wasn't against the law. It was another country. They just went and took their cattle. So, and they figured the guy they were taking it from also was a rustler. So, you know,
Yeah, you know,
easy come, easy go. In the movie, they hang their own friend for being a horse thief, right? Even a guy they'd known for 25 years was a dear friend of theirs. So that kind of sort of played into it. I was like, well, what if there was another country every couple miles or every 10 miles, right? Or just on the other side of the hill, you know?
Right. Yeah. No, and even in my my Dragon Heresy game, my Vikings, I had this whole map and blah blah blah, and then Ken Height's like, yeah, so where do your Vikings go raiding? Oh, well, I've surrounded them with powerful people. I need something disorganized where you can just drop by and kill a few people and take their stuff. But anyway, so that sounds really neat, and I like the thought that was clearly going into enabling adventurous play. But let's segue a little bit into, so how did you mechanize? How did you drive the rules around the kinds of games and the kind of setting that you wanted to play in?
Well, one thing we do pretty much with all our games, we have fairly elaborate character creation process that includes lots of things like quirks and flaws and background, where you know who you're, maybe don't know them intimately, but you know how many brothers and sisters you've had, whether your parents are alive or dead. Some pretty detailed stuff, which takes some time, but it's worth it in the end, because now you kind of have a feel for your character, right? And whether you walk with a limp, or you have a stutter, or you're just ornery, or you have trouble sleeping, those are all things that bring out your character. So believe it or not, people look at it and go, Hackmaster is kind of a hack and slash game, but that was pretty much taken from Hackmaster, which is really fairly heavy into role playing, and the new Hackmaster even more so. In fact, it's the only game I know of that really, in that genre, that really, rewards directly role playing. But in any case, we have a concept called honor, which mechanically tries to. Honor is in Hackmaster. Reputation is what it's called in Aces and Eights, which drives certain character actions as well. Like if you're being insulted by a guy in a bar, in a saloon, you have a reputation to uphold, so you have to figure out what you're going to do. So these are, at the end of the day, it's just ways the game master can push buttons on players. And then the combat system is very realistic, which means that it can be really, really deadly, far more deadly than you expect. In that, you could get one shot into the head and enough damage and you're dead. On the other hand, you could get shot in the head and the bullet could bounce off, which also happened. So the random nature of the combat, coupled with, you know, the fringe end of complete destruction of your character, makes you not want to dive headlong necessarily into a gunfight unless you really think the odds are in your favor. Which, by the way, is how it worked with a lot of the gunfighters in real life. They didn't just like go out the street and fight with anyone. They kind of like, so a lot of times they said, hey, draw, while they were already pulling their gun out, like figuring I could shoot this guy before he'll hopefully clear holster and it'll look like I didn't murder him. But I actually just did murder the guy.
What was the movie with Lou Gossett Jr. and Anthony Edwards? It was a Western. Yeah, you just shot that man in the back. His back was to me. God, what was anyway, I can't remember. But it was a great kind of ringing of the bell against the kind of shootout in the street that everyone sees in the movies, but apparently doesn't happen much. Didn't happen much.
So we have some, we tried to put mechanics into the game to create most of what happened in real life and a lot of what happens in cinema. There are some concepts that you can really improve your chance in combat by taking some serious time risks. Meaning, I want to say it was Wild Bill Hickok who had a reputation for being very cool under fire, and so we have this concept called fire deliberately. And essentially, you wait a really long time and you take very careful aim. Now, meanwhile, your opponent, especially if they're doing something really stupid like hip shooting, or if they're just firing rapidly, they could probably fire 3-4 shots at you before you even get a shot off. But your chance of hitting him is much better. And there's a couple of accounts. In fact, you reminded me of it when you talked about the high noon thing. This is actually one of the few high noon things that were out there and involved that particular persona. And the other guy shot a couple times at him, and he just took careful aim, and then bang, shot him down from like, 25 feet, and everybody was like, wow, he's got ice in his veins or whatever. So that concept's in there. You could do that. Again, it's risky because while the other guy's shooting at you with less chance, if he does happen to hit you, there's a good chance you're done for, right? Or at least you're going to be less
significantly impaired, right? Yeah. And that what you just said about taking careful aim and all that, they did that almost word for word in Unforgiven, right? That's the line between Little Bill and Duchamp the writer.
Which?
In Unforgiven, Little Bill, Gene Hackman's character, is like, he pulls a gun and says, that's about as fast as I can draw and shoot if I ever want to hit anything. Well, what if the other guy's faster? Then he'll miss.
Oh, right.
But basically, that whole scene was basically Gene Hackman and the guy who played the writer, who's the actor's name I can't remember. Did basically just word for word what you just said. So it was a good parallel there.
If you're a cold-blooded killer and you're not nervous, there's another concept in the game you just reminded me of. The number of gunfights you're in, the more gunfights you're in, the better your chances are, better your accuracy is, and the better your speed is. And if you've been in none, you're very penalized. And after your first one, a lot of the penalties go away, but they don't totally go away until your second or third. And at that point, it's sort of like, now you get what it's all about if you've survived that long. That's sort of that concept, that Gene Hackman sort of concept. So that's in there as well. And that actually is a thing. That's from real life. That's a real thing. The biggest difference between the successful gunfighters and, like the John Wesley Hardins who killed like 20 people and kind of the guys that you don't ever hear about, were really nervous. And there's a lot of story. I mean, the one that really strikes me, there's two guys that were in a shootout with each other in a bar, in a saloon. And by the way, saloons back then were like 10 by 14 if they were big. They were actually shooting at each other, each on one side of the bar. And they each emptied their 6-shooter, and then one ran out of the building and reloaded while the other one was reloading inside, and they each emptied another 6-shooter, and nobody was hit.
There's a modern version of that where a police officer and a criminal exchanged a full load of ammunition in the front and back seat of a police car, and no one was hit.
So, I mean, if you take your time and you aim and shoot, you're taking a huge risk, but then when you do shoot, you're gonna do what you're meant to set out to do. So it's, it's a gamble. Do I go fast? So that's part of the game. You got me lost here. I guess we're talking about mechanics.
Yeah, we're talking about mechanics, and so I can steer a little bit because so the realism part of it, we'll get into the shot clock, which is really interesting. It's something that I did in Excel badly, and it was unplayable. I mean, it wasn't designed to be playable. It was, can I simulate bullet spread using GURP statistics? And the answer is yes, but God, you wouldn't do it at the table. So you've managed to bring scatter of fire playably to aces and eights.
Yeah, so I'll say it's not a perfect simulation, but it's pretty darn good. And it really feels like gunfire. And there's a visceral feeling to it because you have this silhouette of the other guy in their pose, whether they're kneeling down or standing or walking or whatever. We have a plethora of silhouettes, and so you take the one that represents the guy, and you put your shot clock on, and you aim it, right? And so you pick where you want to shoot at the guy. So if, let's say, he's drawn down on you, but he's the sheriff's brother, and you just want to disarm him, you want to shoot his gun, you can try to do that. So every shot's a called shot. And if you roll a bullseye, which is 25 on a 20-sided die, meaning you need some modifiers, and that could be that you're at point blank range, or it could be that you're a really good shot, or it could be that you're resting your gun on a solid object, or you've been aiming for a second or two, or consecutive fire, or whatever. There's a million ways you could do it. If you get a 25, you hit exactly where you're aiming. That happens sometimes. More often than not, you don't. But if you can get into the 16, 15, 17, 18 range, then you draw a card, and the shot clock determines randomly where your shot is off. And each single digit increment is rough and tough about a foot on the character you're shooting at. So the idea is you're aiming at a certain spot, and if you miss, you're going to miss on somewhere off. You don't know where it is. It's anywhere in 360 degrees, and we just kind of determine where that is. Where it really gets interesting is when you shoot a shotgun at somebody, because you could miss them entirely, but yet now you've got a gun that scatters. So you've got two factors. First of all, you got a dozen pellets to track. But second of all, the way you track a shotgun that's been shot at you from 8 feet away versus one that's been shot at you from 60 feet away is very, very different. Because I think if most people think about it, even if you don't know anything about guns, it's gonna spread, right? And spreads and spreads and spreads. So there is a sweet spot for shotguns. I'll call that around 25 to 30 feet-ish, where you got a really good shot of hitting them with some pellets, but not so few that it doesn't affect them. But yeah, if you use the shot clock and then you put the shotgun shot clock over it and you determine where the pellets actually go, and you track them based on range. Really interesting is if someone really wants a game that covers all these details, we have a way to do it really fast. And I'll give you some thoughts about that. So how is my character, standing or sitting or kneeling, right? That's automatically covered by what your shot clock is. Called shot, where do I hit them? That's covered. What about if I have cover, right? Well, we've got silhouettes of things like, stoves or troughs or wagon wheels or fencing or whatever. I'm resting my gun on a fence. Okay, well, there's that, right? So you could have cover taken care of. And then when you use the shot clock to determine where the shot goes, you'll know whether it hits the cover or not, which gives you a plethora of other rules depending on how detailed you want to get into. Does the shot actually go through the cover? I mean, if it's a stove, no, unless it's the exhaust. If it's a fence, well, I'll fix the fence, right? Maybe. If it's a plywood wall and it's a boom town, probably you just shot through the wall. So, which absorbs a certain amount of damage, so the character maybe doesn't get hurt as bad. But you could throw all that detail in on a very quick shot. And
right.
The whole concept of hiding, at a window or whatever, when you put the cover silhouette, if you will, over it, there's a super visceral feeling. You're like, wow, now I see him in the window. And now I'm showing where I aim. And if you're the guy on the other end of that, so let's say I'm the game master and I'm shooting at you, and I put my shot clock on your guy instead of center mass, I go ahead. You're looking at it going, what's he's like out to kill. He's like, what? Wait, what? You want to do a headshot on me? Like, it's somehow super offensive suddenly. Because if I do roll that 25, if I do get a natural 20 in the die or something like that, I'm going to blow your head off, maybe. And then you're going to be sitting there watching me roll damage, keeping your fingers crossed your character you just worked on for a year isn't blown away because I decided to shoot you in the head.
Do you feel that the graphically intensive nature of the overlay process helps with keeping the people who are spectators more viscerally involved?
You mean spectators like the other players? Or
yes, yeah. Because I mean, one of the big issues with games that are very realistic is they have the reputation for, okay, while the game master is figuring out the million modifiers that he's going to use on me, everybody else can go for pizza and then come back, and then maybe it'll be their turn.
Well, I'll get to that in a second, but the shot clock itself, when you lay that picture down on the table and you aim, everyone stops what they're doing. No one's looking at their phone. Everyone looks. Everyone's like, first of all, they want to know, where are you aiming? Like, is it a groin shot? Is he shooting him in the show? Where's he aiming? And there's always a crazy guy who thinks he can game the system. He's a gamer. He's like, I'm going to put it way in the upper right here, figuring I got a bad chance to hit. So I'm going to shoot way off, and it just doesn't work. The math doesn't bear out, and they're just shooting their shot into space. But yeah, everyone stops for that. But where the game really shines is in the count-up system, which is calling it an initiative system, but it's really a rolling count. And because of that, as the game master counts up by tenths of seconds, 1, 2, 3, 4, each time, let's say you're running, every 3 counts you get to move. So he says 1, 2, 3, you move yourself. And whatever scale you want. You know, we play with inches is 5 feet, but there's no
whatever, right?
Whatever you want. And everyone at the table is moving at the same time. And then someone says, I want to shoot. Okay, you can shoot right away if your gun's cocked and all that stuff, but then you got to wait half a second to shoot again. So let's say you shot on 6. When he gets to 11, you're going to shoot again. So what this does, when you and I talked about this off camera, it's interesting because both this game and Hackmaster share that system, the count-up system. And what we found, and I would love to say that we were so brilliant we thought of this. We did not. We stumbled upon this. What we found by having these count-up systems is that the wallflowers that come to play at these games, the less aggressive players, the spouses, and significant others that have been dragged along that maybe aren't as hardcore into gaming, that usually get told what to do, don't get told what to do, and are left to their own devices, and they're doing their own thing because everyone's has their hands full managing their own character. And that's a wonderful thing because they end up having a lot more fun playing these games than they do other turn-based games. Because when you play a turn-based game, you go around the table when it's that person's turn. Oh, I brought my cute boyfriend to play or whatever, and he's never played a role-playing game before. Now, everyone at the table has their advice. They're all telling you what to do. The way Hackmaster rolls and the way Aces and Eights rolls, nobody can really do that because they might be able to say something, but the next thing you know, the game master is ticking up a count, and they got to move their own character. And you know what? When push comes to shove, as much as you love your significant other, you love your character more. So you're more worried about what you're going to do next than you are about whether or not they're going to make the exact right move. And that lets them learn and lets them play, and they love it. We found that complete novices do really well in our games.
That's really neat. One question though, how does the GM who might be playing 6 characters manage the count? Because that seems like it's awesome when you got, I'm going to worry about me and I don't have time to shout advice at my wife or girlfriend or my daughter or whatever. But I'm a GM. I'm managing 6 or 8 or 10 guys. How does that work?
Well, the short answer is, so it depends on the game system. So I'll talk about Hackmaster real quickly for a second, and then we'll jump to Aces and Eights. In Hackmaster, you could easily have 8 or 10 orcs or goblins or something like that. And once you get kind of used to the system, it's not that hard to manage them all. And generally, they end up they burst into the room at the same time. They kind of move around at the same time. Then you'll have 1 or 2 outliers. So it's really more like you've got this mob of 6 or 7, and then you've got 2 or 3 others that you keep track of. A lot of people do it on paper, but there's all sorts of game aids out there now where people, lay your characters down, miniatures down on the table. Most people use miniatures nowadays, and they'll have them labeled, A through G or something, and they'll keep track of them that way. So aces and eights. So first of all, aces and eights, you generally, if you're going to have a gunfight with 10 people for the game master and then 5 players, that's a pretty big gunfight. That's going to go a while. Normally a gunfight will be 2-3 different people, especially as you're role-playing. As you're role-playing, what ends up happening is someone's caught cheating at cards and they throw down right there. It's literally two
right,
characters.
One-on-one. Right.
Right. But if you're going to have okay, we're going to ride into the Confederate town and teach them a lesson, and there's going to be 20. That's like, tonight we're going to have that miniature war. That's different. And at that point, you're going to have like a count track and keeping track of all your guys if you want to do that, or have some of your players help or whatever. Most scenarios aren't like that. You may do 3 or 4 on a side, in which case it's not that hard to keep track of. If you're going to have a huge battle, you're going to have a huge battle. It's not a lot different than basically saying, we're going to take our role-playing game, whatever it is, Dungeons and Dragons, and now we're going to have a miniature war. It's a totally different scenario than just a dungeon crawl. And that's sort of like you've described the miniature war of aces and eights, 20 characters. That's not a gunfight anymore. That's a skirmish. That's a
Right.
minor war. Right. I mean, even the shootout at the OK Corral only had like 8 guys involved.
And my understanding of that particular shootout is not only there were 8 guys involved, but if you actually go to the OK Corral, it's like the size of my room here, like 10 by 10. It's tiny. That it was a very, very small space.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of movement. It wasn't a running gun battle through the town. It was, they're all standing there and they threw down, and it lasted like 18 seconds, and about 20 shots were fired, and one guy ran away right away anyway, so you're down to 7 characters.
Right.
That's the game master's answer. Shit, I don't want to keep track of all these guys. This guy runs, he's afraid.
There are 2 things that have sort of come up. Is one is morale, and morale and running away, and no, I don't want to die. We're going to role play my way out of this, and I'll segue into that in a minute. But the other is situational awareness, and one of the things about the count system or the game master management is that in a big battle, not everyone's going to go at once, right? People are taking stock, and the perfect situational awareness that you get when you're staring for a half an hour at a blank piece of paper or a miniatures thing, and you've got your guys, what do I do? That is so far from reality. We were talking yesterday about how I was doing this Viking martial arts combat thing, and it was a battle of 5 or 6 on each person, and either somebody ran up into my face when I was the archer and killed me, or the guy who killed me hit me with a spear from a direction I wasn't looking, and because I didn't have the situational awareness to maintain. So the pace seems like it would reinforce poor situational awareness, which is closer to verisimilitude than not, and very hard to do without onerous rules in most games.
I'd say that is for sure the case. And again, this is another byproduct that it's a happenstance. I'd love to say that we were brilliant enough to go, we're going to design something that would let novices really enjoy a game more, even though it's got a lot more detail and more crunch. No, I'm happy to report that's what it does. This is another thing. When you're playing a battle, especially to a lesser extent aces and eights, there is running around and moving, but if you're playing Hackmaster and there's a dozen orcs on the table and you got 6 characters and an NPC and you have this big pitched battle, characters are moving because they're moving every count. And the example I use is playing the mage, right? If you're the mage and you're kind of standing in the middle and it's like you as the archer, you want to keep people off your shirt. You're like, that's the quarterback, you want to keep that guy clean. As the fighters are eliminating foes or moving, the battle moves. If you're the mage, you can't go and get a Coke. Even if you have no spell points left and there's nothing you can do, you literally can't, because you have to constantly be following around a couple of the tanks and heavies to stay around them or behind them so that you don't get smoked, because the line will disintegrate and orcs will flow through if you're not paying attention. And I'd say, again, the combat is very fluid with a lot of moving around and different things happen. And it's exactly how you describe the situational awareness. You can't keep track of what's happening. If you leave and come back in 10 minutes and you look at the board, it'll look totally different. It's completely different than a turn-based game where, everyone's got to wait for you to come back and take your turn. Everything will have moved. And, if someone falls on either side, things change right away.
Well, I guess the one thing that if you go away and come back that hasn't been is your piece will be lying on its side dead and hasn't moved in many counts.
Right. You're bleeding out.
Right. So let's avoid that. Let's avoid bleeding out, right? We're at a bar or we're around the card table and someone reaches down for the gun. Presumably, since combat is deadly and you've spent all this front-loaded time building your character, what are the social mechanics? What are the conflict avoidance? Fisticuffs. We have to talk about grappling because I always talk about grappling. Is there an argument mechanic or a persuasion? So what is it that you've mechanized because you don't want everything to end into a gunfight? And people do what mechanics enable. If the only thing that you have is a combat system, you're going to resolve everything through combat or free play. It won't be mechanics-based free play, but you'll method act your way with the game master through a situation. How has and let's stick with mostly aces and eights just because you're kickstarting very successfully, I might add. Currently at 56,658 of 20,000, so that's awesome. About halfway to go. 20 days left. Nonetheless, so aces and eights. So you would rather not get into a gunfight because you're outnumbered or because you're in a town where the guy you're really having a fight with is part of the ruling family, so to speak, and that trial will not go well. If all you can do is combat, then all you do is combat. So what other mechanics exist to enable you to not shoot each other?
So aces and eights has a very strong skill system. In fact, one of the changes from the first to second edition ace and eights, in fact, the biggest mechanical change is the skill system. And it's not, it sounds like a huge change. Actually, it's not that big of a change. We had a count down versus a count up kind of, deduct from 100 and that's your total instead of, 7% would be brilliant versus bad. And we're flipping that over. So that's kind of the biggest change. That brings it in sync with Hackmaster, so we can have like a more unified, universal system, if you will. But within the skill system, you have all sorts of things you can do, and you named a few. There's art of seduction or there's persuasion. You have ways that you can try to convince others, which generally the way it works is you try to role play that, and then you'll get a modifier based on your success at that. And I know there's some people that don't like that rule because they feel like I've actually heard that there's an advantage to people that are good at role playing because if they get bonuses to their skills because they've done a good job role playing with Game Master, it's unfair to the other players at the table that maybe aren't as glib and good at role playing.
Right. It's an old player skill versus character skill argument.
Yeah, exactly. To that, I would say it's unfortunate if you look at professional sports that I'm not allowed to do what they do because they just simply happen to be better at baseball than me. So I can't be on the Cubs. That's not fair. Like, look, it's a role-playing game. If they're better at role-playing than you are, then they're going to be more successful than you. So suck it up. So anyway, I mean, I don't know what to say other than it's not fair. They're better at role-playing. Why are they doing better at the role-playing game? I don't know what to tell you.
and there's two ways of doing that, right? One is if you have a good role player who's really good at it, then great, they do it. And if you have someone who's not a good role player and they say, look, help me out, let me just roll skill, at least, maybe ask them to try, maybe don't, or maybe just say, okay, well, think of something next time, but for now, just roll. But, you're not going to get the bonus for just saying, oh, I roll my chemistry skill, or I roll my bluff skill. Yeah, if you're a good skill, you'll do fine. But if you don't have any context to it, you don't get a bonus.
That's exactly the way we resolved it. I mean, you kind of do both. And there's things that, obviously, there's skills that we don't possess, and that's why we're playing a role-playing game because, there's some fantasy element to it. And You know, so anyway, that's a way you can resolve it. You also mentioned grappling. We have a pretty good set of barroom brawl rules that involve 3 different colors of chips, poker chips, and they're based on your different stats of strength, dex, or constitution. And when your constitution chips get to 0, you pass out. So you can actually fight until you've been beaten senseless in a barroom brawl. And again, that's a little bit more of an elaborate process than you do. It's not a 5-minute solve. That's more of like, hey, tonight we're going to have a barroom brawl, and we're going to spend an hour setting up a saloon, and guys are going to get hit over the head with empty bottles, and the dancing girl's going to get involved and all that bit, right?
Right.
That's one of the tropes that we have an ability to do that, and that's one of the micro games. You mentioned trials. We have a trial micro game that's fairly involved. I mean, if your character's caught and you're tried for murder, it's not much fun to have a percentage roll, kind of resolve that. So I'll tell you right now, I got 5% left of my battery.
Okay, well let's pitch the Kickstarter.
Okay, the Kickstarter is going very well. We've hit a ton of stretch goals already. I think at last count, there's $80 of free stuff, PDFs primarily, if you buy one of the hardcover books, which is fantastic. I think if you spend $60 in a book, you're going to get $140 worth of stuff. Or even if you get a $40 PDF, I think you get $40 of free stuff already. We have a ton of really cool stretch goals. We have some interesting miniatures I think people would be interested in. We have things that we call casualty counters, which are little black plastic silhouettes of guys that are down. And on one side, they've got a red blood splatter. So you can put them with this red blood splatter face up if they're dead, or you can put them just black face down, and that means they're incapacitated, or maybe they've just had enough of the gunfight in this case. We also have those for mounts. So if you have to make a fort out of your horse, you could do that. And then we have actually these stand-up silhouette guys that are also plastic, and those are good for creating crowds.
Oh, sure.
What that's good for is a guy gets off the stage and you had a score to settle with him, and there's a whole crowd of people, and you take a shot and you miss. We have this great shot clock, and it tells you exactly where you missed. So now you can actually see if you hit someone's grandmother, and then you can the next week go in with the trial, and you can see whether or not you get hung for murder. So it all kind of dovetails together. We have, I think our next stretch goal is coming up in a couple thousand. We should hit that by the end of the week or so. And that one is some overlays of cover, which are great because you can put those straight over the top, and you can still see through to the silhouette. So that way, like I said, if if you're shooting a buffalo rifle and a guy's hiding behind a fence and you hit the fence, you're still going to hit the guy. If it's a Derringer, you hit the fence, nothing happens. But you want to know if you have a buffalo rifle and you hit the cover exactly what part of his body's on the other side of the cover, right? Because
right. And it also looks like your guys are on track to get the Roll20 support, which is cool.
Yeah, that's coming up soon, and I think that's really relevant. I do most of my gaming face to face, but playing over the internet is definitely the future, and it's the next big wave. And people's college buddies are all over the country. You want to game with them, and systems like Roll20 are so good now. It's very close, and just doing this hangout, I mean, it's like we're face to face almost.
Yep.
It's very close to the table experience. It's not quite the same, but it's got to be like 80% there. So we have a pretty good set of tools for that, and they're very Western-esque. And I think people will be very happy with those when we hit that goal.
No, that's really cool. So just to make sure that you get in the last word before your battery dies, so where can we find you at Gen Con? Because you said you've been at Gen Con like every year for like 30 years. So where is Kenzer and Company kick out at Gen Con, and what kind of games are you going to be running there so that we can come actually try this stuff?
I've got no idea where our booth is, but we usually have 4 booths. So it's if you walk the floor, it's hard to miss us, but you can look us up, and we're pretty much a destination booth. So Thursdays are usually really, really busy. I'd say Fridays are a good day to come visit us. Thursdays and Saturdays are the hard ones at Gen Con, but We'll be running Hackmaster and Aces and Eights at the booth. So if you want to come try either of those games, definitely a good place to do it, although it's very loud at Gen Con. So that makes it a little bit more difficult. And actually, one of the stretch goals of the Kickstarter was to stay in our house with us at Gen Con. That one's already been taken.
Oh, fun.
It included 3 nights of stay and then 1 shootout. So,
an actual shootout, or
an Aces and Eights shootout.
Oh,
okay. Simulated role-playing game shootout.
Because you were telling me about the background of you guys. I could see bringing airsoft or Nerf.
When we first started, live action role playing was really big, and I really wanted to do live action gladiatorial combat at Gen Con and bring in real tigers, but they didn't want us to do that. So
well, after the Siegfried and Roy thing, it just wasn't the same.
Right.
Okay. Not only do I want to thank you for coming, I want to thank you for coming twice, because it was really nice of you to come back and give more of your time after the technical foibles yesterday. But we had a different conversation today, so that was good. I mean, it wasn't stilted, and we got some things that I learned that I didn't know from yesterday. So that was great. So I'm in at the $80 level. I'll say it for the Aces and Eights. I wanted that leather bonded book. I like tangible stuff. I'm happy to do PDF, but if I can have it and look at it and feel it, I'm looking forward to it. So I'm glad you funded it, and I really hope you get that virtual gaming pack. So everyone check out the Kickstarter. And I would say that at least for people who are just getting into the hobby, Kenzer and Company seems more than what you might think. It's a broad product portfolio that has some really exciting stuff going on.
Well, thank you for having me. I had a really good time. We should do this again sometime, and I won't try to pimp my stuff. We could just talk about design philosophy or something. It's fun.